quickly, I want to stop talking, give you folks a chance to ask some questions about this portion. Are there questions about this method? This is open to anyone. Productive things, things that I need to clarify.
What effectively, like in a round, would be the difference between the IPM and 3-tier?
Normally the way I think about this now is, they are similar, right? They're different ways of talking about the same thing. It's almost like in a policy context when some people call it significance and some people call it an advantage, or some people call it a harm and some people call it an advantage, however you want to think about it. But yeah, this is just a different way of organizing this information. The reason this method is powerful, if you use it properly, is because, for instance, if the affirmative, this is a very powerful negative performance strategy, because if the affirmative, for instance, that only contains traditional intellectuals, then you have disads against them, right? They didn't personally invest. They didn't use an organic intellectualism. So what does that say about their advocacy? Well, their advocacy is a vision from nowhere, right? Because they don't know how they relate to their topic. They don't know why they're an advocate for their topic. They don't have the necessary advocacy skills to be able to carry through the coherent argument for that because they've never grounded it in real people in the real world, right? They didn't start in the right spot. They didn't start with themselves. That's a disad to the ad, right? In the same way that if they don't engage in organic intellectualism, you can make a academic elitism argument. That these people up here may be so detached from the situations that they discuss that they don't ever care about these people who have lived experiences about these issues, right? So, for instance, if you were talking about this in the context, like back when I was in high school, there was a topic about mental health, right? And up here, there would be people talking about, scientific visions of mental health, the DSM-4, all of these things, right? But a person down here, an organic intellectual that has understanding about mental illness, someone like Antonin Artaud, a French madman who received 60 electrical shock treatments at the end of his life, he probably has a much different notion about the way that psychiatric medicine works than these elites up here, right? These experts. Because the experts have never had to live the consequences of the choices that they make. So those are disads to the app. Likewise, each of these, if they don't have an organic intellectual, becomes its own disad, right? Well, if you're here advocating for this policy at the end of the debate that we all know, we're going to talk about fiat in a second, we all know doesn't actually get passed at the end of the day, well, what are we trying to do? Well, maybe we're trying to build coalitions with other people to create some political activism or action or notion that this is going to be a type of thought that we're going to change. Well, you have to build coalitions with people to be able to do that, right? And if you never considered their perspective and their point of view, right, if you only talk to the experts, then that's a potential problem, right? The easiest way to think about this is, I know the person I was talking to you about, Ryan, makes this argument all the time. Well, where he came from, you weren't allowed to call the government to help you out, Calling the police was bad, it didn't happen. So when he and his friends go looking for solutions to the problems that they experienced, they didn't try to solve poverty by going and asking the state for more money, right? They tried to solve poverty by organizing themselves in a particular way, right? This caused him and a number of his friends to become debaters, go to college, and now go to graduate school and going to be, big-time college debate coaches, right? That is part of the magical power of debate, right? That it can do these type of things. Again, if it's not counter-hegemonic, just add to the app. So this is all set up in a way to turn each of these pieces into offense for you, if you think about them correctly. I've seen people who do the 3-tier method literally divide their flow into 4 sections and just write out disads for each of these 4 points. And that's the way they organize the debate. And that can work for you. That's one of the advantages to using a highly structured method like this. Now, A lot of the other affirmatives that we do engage in a more narrative approach, a more essay-oriented approach. They're less structured, so it might not be as easy to deploy as this, but the ideas underlying it are still there. So this was really, this identity, purpose, and method thing, I guess, was really a way of freeing this up from structure, I guess, if that makes sense. And for me, it was important to free this up from structure because a lot of the people that we were talking about in the context of these arguments are profoundly distrustful of structure like this, right? Rote ways of thinking, organized ways of thinking. So in order to free ourselves from the type of thinking that they thought was bad, we had to free our approach from structure to some extent. So part of the point of this is, you know, to be able to make it how you want it to look, which brings up the question of form and content. So kids will come up to me on my team all the time and say, well, how should my 1AC look? You know, act like I'm a big expert. I don't know, right? What does the content of the argument tell you your 1AC should look like, right? If you're making an argument about deconstruction, you should probably have your 1AC not engage in highly rigorous structure, right? If you are engaging in some sort of aesthetic form of debate, music, poetry, or whatever, you better make sure your 1AC has some inherent aesthetic beauty to it. Otherwise, it's not going to work out, right? If you're like, aesthetics are the most important thing, and then you get up and you go, observational inherency, right? That's not aesthetically beautiful. That doesn't work, right? So the form and the content are different. This form and content also explains why traditional policy debate in many ways is the way it is, right? Because if the content of the information is most important, right, just the facts, the bare facts of things are the most important thing, then the presentation of the way we engage in debates is less important, right, than the content itself, right? This is why when you're in front of judges who come from these traditional backgrounds, it's a really good idea to make sure that your evidence says exactly what you want it to say, and make sure that you have contradicting claims to every piece of evidence that they're going to make, right? That's sort of the way that worked because content was so important. But in this style of debate, form is an equal consideration to content, right? And I would give a couple of examples here. All of us have been in the round where we are going for hedge good, hedge bad, right? We've all had this debate. It's one of my favorites, right? Side over here, hegemony good. We need to be the global leader. We need to be able to put down conflicts over here. And this side over here is saying, no, we need to play nice with people and we need to be the kinder, gentler American leader. But then this side over here is just like, we're killing them on the hedge bad debate. They're going to get smashed in their faces, right? That's a very hegemonic way of engaging in the hedge bad debate, right? And if form and content matters, then you should probably think about the way you present that information, right? If the kinder, gentler approach is the way that we should resolve conflicts, then when we're resolving conflicts in debate, we should probably engage in those types of behaviors. So I guess what I want to say is, in terms of form and content, is try to pass the smell test, right? That when someone hears your 1AC or your argument, that it makes sense to them in terms of the way it looks, sounds, and gets received, because otherwise you're going to open yourself up to pretty negative arguments about that. The second example I'll give you of that is an affirmative that we negated where a team was reading a Spanos argument. And for those of you who know anything about Spanos, you know it's about how American exceptionalism is bad, okay? And in order to make this argument, as we were reading through their 1AC, we noticed that every author in the 1AC was an American. And not only was every author in the 1AC an American, it was an American military person, right? Some of them were war reporters, some of them were soldiers, right? But the form and content didn't really match. If we were trying to combat American exceptionalism, then why was it that only Americans got to speak on that issue, right? Where was the perspective of those who apparently aren't recognized right now, according to the app, right? So you need to really think about those things. If you're gonna try to combat American exceptionalism, you should probably not only include the perspective of Americans, but include the perspective of those who are left out of these discussions in most cases, right? And that's all about identity and belonging. Because at some point, all of us are gonna walk into this debate room and we're gonna have to be able to survive in here. So that's a pretty important thing. Yeah, so forming content is really important. Questions about that stuff? You guys aren't very questioning. Am I that intimidating, or do we just not have questions?
All week they've been this quiet.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Cool. Do we need a dance or anything? You don't need just that. Yeah, good.
When you're running like a strategy like this, what do you have to tell the judge to like win the round? Like
Yeah.
what do you tell them to help for?
Cool. That's a good question.
Good
Roles.
job.
Good question. Great job. Roles. This is important. If your purpose is identity and belonging, then everybody needs to have a job inside of this space, right? So after your identity, method, and purpose, you better sure have your role, the affirmatives role, right? This will often be accompanied with a roll of the ballot. A roll of the ballot is a metric by which you think the judge should evaluate the round. Okay? So at the end of the debate, what is the judge making this decision based upon? Are they making this decision based upon who engages in the best activism skills? Are they judging this debate based on who is the most aesthetically pleasing, right? Are they judging this debate based on whose content was the best? Are they judging this debate based on who maintains the most accessible space for people to participate in debate, right? Your roll of the ballot needs to be something that both sides can access, okay? And I know for a fact that my teams violate this rule themselves many times when they write bad versions of these arguments, and I will admit that they exist, right? But the roll of the ballot should be something that both sides can access, right? So if the question is who engages in better activism skills, if you can win that my activism in this 1AC doesn't do anything, but if we were to have a federal government use a method of a federal government plan, right, then you've engaged in the better activism, right? So that roll of the ballot can be whatever you want it to be, essentially. So the roll of the ballot normally puts a role of the judge, right? You want to be able to tell the judge what they're doing here, right? Judges aren't just plain arbiters of facts. You want to be able to tell them what things are important. It's like any form of debate. Write the ballot for the judge at the end of the debate. What are the most important issues, right? Often think about this in terms of creating priority. Right? So create priority for your epistemological background, create priority for your style of presentation, create a priority for your mode of activism, whatever it happens to be. But you want the judge to know what their purpose is, and of course there needs to be a role of the negative. I'm going to talk about how to answer these arguments a little bit in a while. But the negative needs a role too, right? If we're talking about identity and belonging, then what is the role of the negative? How are they supposed to engage in these debates, right? And many times you'll hear someone say, well, you can have a method debate with us, right? Pick your own method and we'll debate you about which is better. Or, you have to be able to defend, your epistemological background for the way you produce knowledge in this debate space, right? So the role of the neg is to prove that the way that they think about the world is the correct way. So we have to have debates about empiricism versus wisdom versus statistical analysis versus personal experience. Those are the type of debates that are going to happen when these debates go down well, right? And oftentimes when they don't go down well, because one of the teams, be it the performance team or the other team, leaves out one of these roles, and then there's somebody in the round who doesn't have a place to participate. And that's where we get into ugly, bad versions of this type of debate. Yeah. So create priority, talk about the stuff you want to talk about, and then make sure that everyone has a role in the debate, and then access your role at the ballot best, right? Is the easiest way. The other thing I'll say is, in terms of all of these things, when it comes to winning these rounds, I think one of the most important ideas, especially if you're AF, is to maintain the debate on your ground, right? Because it's very easy to start a debate in a very performative way, have the other side get up and read 5 off, and then go back to the regular line-by-line way of answering those arguments, right? Well, remember, form and content matters. So if you start the debate one way, you should probably finish it one way. So make sure that you stick to your guns and answer these arguments in a way that is sort of fulfills the logic of what you're doing. So be AF. If you're AF, stay on the AF ground. If you're neg, stay on your neg ground. Like any other type of debate, it's all a struggle about who gets to talk about their stuff the most. So present your argument in as clear and credible a way as you can. Make sure that you're the person who accesses the role of the ballot best, and you should be good. Yeah.
Now, when you're answering arguments, like, how do you, like, do you have your forms today?
Mhm.
And how do you, like, apply the arguments of like against whatever?
Sure. Yeah, this is a good question too. How do you, is your question how you use your
Yeah,
performance
like, how
argument
do you
to answer?
use your performance to answer the typical, like, policy arguments?
Right. So, for instance, let's go back to this example here, right? Framework. I'm not gonna lie to you. You do this kind of debate and you're gonna have 90% framework debates. You're gonna debate about what debate should be about, you know? And if that doesn't sound like fun to you, then don't do it, right? You have to have your place to belong too. But if it does sound like something that's interesting to you, then certainly engage in that. These framework debates are gonna happen all the time. In the context of this app, the way I would write the framework argument would be to start with the affirmative. What does the affirmative say about the way we have these discussions? Well, it says right now, in the status quo, we see only one side of the conflict. Right? So this is an epistemology argument. Again, epistemology being the way that we produce knowledge. You would make this argument and say, right now, the status quo, we only see one side of the conflict. So we are academically short-sighted, right? We don't have the entire picture. So then when we go to engage in policies where we try to resolve problems like this, we will necessarily engage in a certain form of error replication, right? Because we are going to follow the same standard procedures that we have engaged in the first place, and that will produce similar outcomes, right? So I would say right now we have a problem is that we only see one side of the conflict. The app frees us, right, from this blind spot, right? And then we would probably talk about these paintings, right? And then talk about the way that if we thought about these problems differently, we could solve them. I would go back to a couple quotes in here. I'd probably talk about that quote from Lyndon Johnson, where he says that war is an episode of madness, right? Not a policy choice to resolve conflicts, meaning that we can't solve these problems by U.S. federal government alone can't solve, right? The U.S. federal government has attempted to resolve these problems and failed, which probably means that there is a social component to the reasons that we go into these conflicts, that it is not just a decision based on policy, but it has something to do with the way that we think about and view the people that we are going into conflict with, right? And if you've read like dehumanization evidence, evidence like the Berube evidence, you'll get this idea that one of the reasons we go to war with people is because we are capable of defining them as non-human, right? That is why, if you look at propaganda, for instance, during the Holocaust, the Jews were disproportionately depicted as rats, right? Or vermin, cockroaches. Or during the Vietnam War, for instance, we would dehumanize the Viet Cong by calling them all Charlie, right? Giving them a sort of subhuman status. Or we would talk about them crawling through their tunnels in the earth like, again, like vermin, right? That is one of our arguments would be that those social questions are a necessary condition to being able to solve problems like this. And you can't do that with U.S. federal government action alone. You have to engage in activism. You have to change hearts and minds of people. You can't just make a policy that will erase problems like this, right? And if you go to the question of race, that argument is similarly deployed, right? We probably can't solve racism by passing a bill that says racism needs to stop, right? We tried it, and racism has become more covert, and it's still problematic. We still live in, a dangerously segregated society. Omaha is a great example of that. And so the question is can we engage in the social project of changing people's minds to help them understand that things like racism, just because it exists doesn't mean it has to exist. Just like this says, just like human slavery and human sacrifice, these are problems that we could get rid of if we wanted to, but we have continuously engaged in the wrong form of thinking about these problems, so we need to change it. And framework is simply locking us into a mode of thinking that causes us to create these kinds of moral blind spots in our thinking. So yeah, the number one way to answer any argument is to figure out how your app interacts with it, right? Similarly, we've read some deconstruction type apps with these. Deconstruction deals with the idea that words don't have static meanings, that language and the way that we construct reality can sort of unwind itself in certain ways and reveal different new meanings for us. And so if people read topicality on us with those arguments, of course we have embedded arguments against topicality. Yes, these words may mean the way you want them to mean sometimes, but words can also strike multiple poses, which means that the resolution is probably not a static statement that can be defined down to one coherent action, but is really a starting point for an infinite possibility of launching point for the way that we should think about how we do politics, right? And so, the best way to think about these things is to try to figure out what your app would say about it, right? Which is the form and content piece again. So those are some examples, yeah.
Do you want to kind of go through how, on a negative, if we see this happen,
Sure.
What would be the best strategy to approach it and attack it without, massively offending the other team or a judge who is used to this?